I'm going to go through just a few quick points here. What I want you guys to know primarily from the reading is a little bit of the background and history um, about safe schools, how these things developed, the idea of enumeration to be able to describe what enumeration means, and then a little bit about, again, the background in terms of Massachusetts, how they developed, and then we'll learn some key, like different policies that are used in schools, safe zones, GSAs, um, uh, different paradigms for safe school programs, anti-bullying, and then like the Safe Schools Improvement Act. We'll talk about a little bit. Just wanted to mention that the reading that we have for today is sort of a synopsis of a larger project. It was a book that the author here wrote. He was a professor. I thought he was at Harvard for a while, but he's now at Bard College, um, so in this area. I'll skip over a few quick points. I always like to give a little bit of a background of policy and law in Indiana, um, and what kind of led up to things. And one really important point that I do want you to remember from the reading is that the author says that marriage equality was kind of a watershed moment in LGBT, Q kind of rights, and a bit of a changing point for the country. And to connect that to a different reading from this semester, one of the things I mentioned was in the reading on Brown versus Board of Education that reintroduced the notion of substantive equality, or kind of reasserted the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause into our constitutional legacy. And when marriage equality was signed into law, and we mentioned how that impacted women with Title IX and people with disabilities with ADA and then IDEA and other forms of legislation. Um, for marriage equality, the 14th Amendment was directly quoted and cited by the justices at our Supreme Court. And that's why I had predicted basically that marriage equality would become the law of the land, even though we have a pretty conservative Supreme Court, because of that expansion that's occurred under the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause since Brown versus Board of Education. What happened in Indiana was there was a proposal to amend our state constitution to define marriages between a man and a woman. That was already part of Indiana law prior to marriage equality, but there was a push to make it part of the constitution. That was rejected by all of the major public universities in the state, and a lot of businesses and others. So then there was, of course, the marriage equality movement, and marriage equality became the law of the land by order of the Supreme Court. And then what happened in a number of states was a backlash. In Indiana, was one of those states that had kind of a clear backlash, and one of the first states really to have one. And we Mike Pence, the governor at that time, signed into law what was known as RFRA, which was the Restore Religious Freedom Act. And it really sort of opened the gates for discrimination against the LGBTQ community. And Mike Pence said that wasn't the intention of the law, but the people who had really wrote the law and lobbied for it, who were kind of seeing this picture was widely circulated at the time, and had made some really damaging statements, and were all very anti-LGBT. Um, so, um, so yeah, that was kind of part of it. And then what happened really was a backlash against the law. There was a major backlash. Even the Republican governor of Indianapolis, like opposed the law. And a number of other Republicans and lawmakers really saw it as going too far and worried about the damage it would do to Indiana. And Angie's List is a large company in Indiana. They put on hold a multi-million-dollar extension of their company after RFRA was signed. The NFL and NBA said they would no longer host championship games here in Indiana while the law was in place. Salesforce, which is a big major national company, was offering employees money to move out of Indiana at that time if they wanted. States put travel bans in place against Indiana. So it really had that created a huge economic impact. and Indiana could not sustain it. And so 3 days after he said he wouldn't change the law, then Mike Pence went back on that and actually amended the law and got rid of it. A couple other states sort of followed with similar laws, and the same sort of thing happened, where there was a major backlash against it, and things sort of changed. The picture that you see up here now, I just one of the weeks that I taught this was right after the Pulse nightclub shooting, which was a gay bar in Florida. And then an Indiana man was fortunately apprehended shortly after that on his way to the LA Pride Festival. Pride Month is going on now around the country, um, Pride parades and things like that. This man was on his way to the LA one. He was from Indiana. Um, Fortunately apprehended before he could do damage. I thought I'd mention that we rate now, and I think this is something in most states. Like Indiana has this very complex sort of situation where on the one hand you have things like REFRA and the guy who I just mentioned, and this sort of you know intense kind of like backlash and hatred in some cases, and then also too we have an openly gay candidate for MP Buttigieg, for president of the United States, who's polling strongly and has been, I think, as high as second place in some polls, behind Joe Biden, as a potential candidate for the Democratic nomination to run for president. From South Bend, Indiana, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And that's him with his partner. Um, I also like to mention that even though we have marriage equality, most states around the country do not have protections in place for LGBTQ or on the basis of sexual orientation. And Indiana is one of those states where we do not have protections in place. So you could be kicked out of your apartment on the basis of your sexual orientation. You could be fired from your job. All these kinds of things, and there's no recourse there. And I think most people think that sex discrimination is actually covered under law, but it's not. Um, and that was one of the reasons that REFRA in Indiana was so damaging, because there weren't kind of those prohibitions in place. Um, some states have passed laws to protect employees, and one of the areas, I mean, of course, among many, where I think it's particularly significant is in the case of teachers and educators, because it protects them, and prevents them from being fired basically purely on the basis of their sexuality. And I think in many cases teachers are worried about being fired. And if you're not familiar, it was at a private school, but there was a teacher, I think within the last year or two, who was fired from her job for her sexual orientation. She had mentioned her wife to some people, and it got around, and there was some pressure applied. I think everybody at the school really liked her, even the administrators, but she was let go. She appeared on Ellen, um, and it caught national headlines. I also want to mention no promo homo laws. These are laws that are in place around the country in the states here listed in red, and they literally forbid teachers from mentioning um, anything related to same-sex relationships or homosexuality, um, and prevent, like, for example, even in health classes, from sort of mentioning or talking about homosexuality. In some cases, the way the laws are written is that you can only say that the only respectable marriage is between a man and a woman, or you can't talk about any of those issues. And so I think it makes the teachers in those states really incredibly vulnerable, um, and they're just really problematic. I think most of the research has shown um, that they do affect teachers and students in those states. Um, So, and yeah, these would explicitly block enumeration. We'll get to what enumeration means. On the other hand, there are a number of states that you kind of see here in the dark green, that have laws covering um, sexual orientation and gender identity. And that's sort of when we get to enumeration, what enumeration means. So basically, enumeration is just a set of proactive policies that are put in place to address, um, I mean, bullying and things more generally. So, enumeration is basically it puts kind of the onus on teachers to deal with things when they come up, and then gives them it's like it would say that each school has to develop a way to handle um, situations when kids are harassed or bullied or pressured or those kinds of things, and it really identifies conditions or certain factors that where kids might be targeted, and then puts in place a policy to deal with it. So it's not exclusively LGBTQ. Um, it could say that, look, on the basis of religion or religious identity, kids might be targeted, or disability, or sexual orientation. And it might take all of those categories and then say, look, each school needs to have a policy in place when those students are harassed or you know, um, targeted in some way, and to deal with them. Um, this began, again, to give you the background, like the Safe Schools program for LGBT at least happened in about the 1990s, or shortly before that. Um, well, the programs actually began in the 1990s. So I think, schools began to see that there were significant problems. Kids often didn't feel safe in school. And so that was kind of the core idea. And I think what the author's position is that, look, these are an essential essential to have. Like, it's you have to, kids really to learn and to flourish need to feel safe. That should be an obvious baseline. But that these aren't that's not an end goal in itself, that we should move beyond that to helping kids feel affirmed. And so I think he feels like, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but maybe we focused a little bit too much, or at least got to the point where we focused on safety as kind of issue, but we should kind of continue to push beyond that. Um, so yeah, bullying programs have grown. A number of states introduced legislation after Massachusetts. I will say that research shows that those programs and policies, when put in place, are effective. So enumeration does work, and I'll try to give you examples of that. I don't know if I uploaded it, but if you look at the GLSEN survey, when you look at the data, uh, Indiana has higher than average rates of harassment, physical violence, and bullying for kids in the LGBT community compared to other states. And Indiana is not enumerated. So enumerated states tend to have lower rates or incidence of those. And then districts, or if there's a difference by district, the districts that are enumerated have, again, better situations for students. This is some of the data, and I don't think this is from the most recent. Um, this is, I think, from 2011 or 2012, and then we now have 2017, and then I believe the 2019 is just being released. What I've seen between 2011 and 2017 is that some areas have improved, some that are fairly positive in Indiana, but there's still really high incidence, and there's still major problems in a number of these areas. So in some of these areas, things have gotten better, but still a large segment of the population hear negative remarks, and then experience harassment and assault in Indiana schools. So around sexual orientation, you can see that far exceeds the other categories like religion, disability, race, ethnicity. Um, and again, some of these have gotten a little bit better, slightly. You'll see slight improvement, but still major problems. I do want to point out that I do want to think one of the positive things, and this has actually gotten a lot better. You can see how few schools in Indiana have a comprehensive policy up at the top. Less than 1%, or around 1% of schools have a policy around LGBT students and harassment. But most students report that they have at least one supportive educator, and in the new data that's come out, feel that they have multiple educators who are supportive. So teachers at their school who are supportive, and I used to use a different reading for this topic previously, and in that topic, like it was actually the narratives of students that you get to read, and a number of them whose parents rejected them after they came out or things like that said that it was really a teacher that kind of helped them navigate and get through things. It was the teacher that kind of guided them. This is really, I think, important. The other thing I wanted to say that since 2011 to 2017, what's really increased pretty dramatically are the number of gay-straight alliances in Indiana, and I want to say they've about doubled. So I think about 40 schools, 40% of schools in Indiana now have a GSA. Inclusive curriculum is still pretty low. It's gotten better, but it's still pretty low. Now, one of the things that I like about the reading that I selected for this is that I think it focuses on a lot of the proactive, positive things, but I also too like to mention some of the issues and why I think this is a really important issue. And homelessness, I have a friend who ran a homeless shelter, and anybody who works in that industry or in that area will tell you that this is a major problem in the United States, the population of homeless youth. And of course, in a lot of instances, or the vast majority of this comes from being rejected by family. Suicide is disproportionately high among the LGBT community. And I always like to mention, along with this, to point out with this data that these rates change. I mean, that it's the context in what these kids find themselves. When there's a supportive environment, you don't have the same type of disproportionate suicide rates. So experiences with violence, as I mentioned before, are significant. 6 out of 10 feeling unsafe at school, which is a pretty astounding statistic. The CDC, this is the Centers for Disease Control, so this is a federal department that's collecting this data and a reputable source, and you can see that they note the same kind of numbers and issues. And to note that the significance of a positive school climate, which is associated with decreasing depression, suicidal feelings, substance abuse, and other issues. And then they talk a lot about the same sort of things that are talked about in the reading. The CDC does, how much a supportive environment and support groups can be helpful and effective. All right, so this is something I usually like for students to go over with the reading, but to look at places like safe zones, gay-straight alliances, and anti-bullying programs. I'm going to go through these really quickly, but I want to make sure I mention with anti-bullying programs, I really like a point that the author makes that I resonate very strongly with, which is that sometimes the problem is when you have something that's listed as as bullying or a policy around bullying. If the definition of that is too broad or unclear, you can have things that are actually illegal or forms things like physical assault and other things that get labeled as bullying when in fact they're really criminal activities, and should be dealt with in a more significant way. So, and I really think that to me resonates too, that sometimes what people think of as bullying or that definition is so broad and unspecific that it ends up encapsulating a lot of things that are actually like genuine harassment or physical assault. It should be dealt with in a different way. All right. There's been a number of high-profile harassment cases in the national media. Sometimes in the past, I've referenced, some of the high publicity, like suicide or things that have happened. Iowa signed the Safe Schools law. There's at the national level. It's been in Congress for a while. There's been no movement on it, but the Safe Schools Improvement Act, so it could be passed by our national legislature, which, given the state of our politics right now, doesn't seem likely. But you never know. And something that could be lobbied for. And yeah, educators need to have a responsibility. I always like to frame this when I teach this in class as part of a professional ethic. That in the position of teacher, there's a professional ethic that people need to think about and sort of contemplate in relation to this issue. So I'm going to go through some of the different policies or practices that are used. One is the safe zone, and I did safe zone training at Ball State. Ball State regards itself as kind of a pioneering university in sort of the safe school zone movement. Um, it's nothing overly. I think it's good. You know, you're exposed to information and things that inform you. Um, in the training, at least, you know, what are some of the issues people face, and it's good to be able to hear from people in the community, things they went through as students, things like that. You know, but it doesn't like you're not obviously if you go through the training, you're not like qualified for therapy or anything in particularly. It just I think helps prepare you. And in terms of, I know on the one hand you can just argue that of course everywhere should be somewhat of a safe space. Your school should all be a safe space. But I think when you put up the sign, I have it up in my office. It just sort of designates and to people that that you're an ally, that you care about them. I think, and that it's just there as a marker. I think to be a reminder. And there is research and a clear indication that when people put up those sort of safe zone markers, students feel more comfortable talking openly to those people. And then I also thought I'd mention, that marker is generally in the form of a triangle. And that triangle, the pink triangle, the root of that is from the Holocaust. That's how, quote, homosexuals were marked and sort of tagged in the Nazi concentration camps. And it's been that symbol has been reappropriated. So yeah, here's an example of the safe zone sign. As a teacher, you're often required to do a certain number of professional development hours, and I always like to mention to teachers that safe zone training is a good option for that in my mind. It's also something you could do before you leave Ball State if you have time, and they're put on periodically. The safe zone trainings are, and now they have trans safe zone trainings that are on campus as well. Um, all right. I thought I'd mention the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, the Indiana Youth Group. It's an organization in Indiana. They have they're connected to kind of a national organization, and they have a lot of really good information on their website. Things that I'll get to, but for teachers, inclusive curriculum, um, things about mentoring or being a part of a GSA, those kinds of things. So a lot of really good information and data on their website. GSAs are the other things that I want to mention. Every time it's kind of hit or miss. Like sometimes I'll ask a class full of like 2024 students how many had a GSA at their high school. Sometimes I have 2 or 3 raise their hand, but sometimes almost half the class will raise their hand, say they had a GSA at their school. Gay Straight Alliance is just a club, extracurricular. Um, if schools have any extracurricular clubs, they are legally required to allow a GSA to exist at their school. I know a lot of administrators, fearing backlash, have pushed back against these in Indiana. I think they over anticipate sometimes the reaction that it's going to have, and honestly, I think sometimes there's a little bit of an initial reaction, but then over time, like I just don't think people, it just sort of dissipates. And overall, research shows that schools with GSAs are better environments for LGBTQ youth. Um, I I would say that primarily what most of these clubs do is maybe somewhat between just social activities and some level of consciousness raising activities. Um, things like maybe the Day of Silence or certain things like that to draw maybe some attention to some of the issues, but again, nothing overly political or outside the realm of what other clubs do. Some schools have reacted so harshly to GSAs that they actually got rid of all their extracurricular clubs to prevent a GSA. That's how significant the reaction's been sometimes. And there was an example of that in Franklin, in Indiana, one of the districts here. at least, reacted so harshly to a GSA that they got rid of all their extracurricular activities to get rid of it. And then it went to court, and they reversed their position over time, but they haven't had a teacher that's been willing to step up. And that's the other thing, is that the clubs always need a teacher to be a to oversee the club or whatever. To mention it. I always thought I mentioned Ball State. Ball State's GSA. Every state university has a GSA. Our GSA is Spectrum, and again, primarily just social outlet and maybe some level of activism, but primarily consciousness raising is the way I would describe it. The motto for Spectrum is, or at least was, I think they changed it, but it was, just because you're here doesn't mean you're queer. And the idea is that it's an open club for everyone. It's about bringing people together. And one of I'll mention great things they do on campus every year is the drag show. And if you ever get a chance to go, I think it's one of the funnest kind of positive events on campus. It's an extracurricular kind of thing that I've been to. That raises money generally for a good cause, and a very positive event. This is the court case I was mentioning, in terms of Franklin Township Community School Corporation when they got rid of the GSA. Um, so again, I think that just people overreact to them, and really once they're allowed and they develop, I feel like they things get better, but they're not like a flashpoint, or people don't feel. Um, so yeah, I just think sometimes people over anticipate. But I mean, sometimes there is a significant reaction. So there's great information on the website that I mentioned earlier for Indiana Youth Group, um, around starting a GSA and how to do that. PFLAG's another organization that I've sometimes mentioned. This has a great story behind it. It was started by a mother, um, of a young man who was arrested multiple times, and she started this organization as a way for parents of same-sex, or LGBTQ teenagers. I think it's expanded. It's sort of its domain a bit. There are chapters throughout Indiana, um, and it's just a way parents come together, I think, and support their children. All right. This is from the previous reading, so I don't think we kind of it. I'm gonna kind of skip over some of this stuff, and I'm trying to think if there's any additional points. Um, um, I would look at some of the data again, kind of as presented in the reading. Um, the number of students that mention that they have a supportive educator, and exposure to inclusive curriculum and some of those other issues. Be familiar with